Well, folks, good morning to you, Deebsha. It's Misha Jerry Adams, ag Yonu Oglov, leis our Cara, Richie Neal, Richie and DC, stoit Intaha, agus Misha and Shaw and Aras O'Conneilla, and well, first, it's Jerry Adams here, and I'm really pleased to be able to talk to my friend, long-time supporter of the Irish cause, Congress member Richie Neal, and we'll just wander through the different issues that present themselves in this short interview. And it's an honor for me to talk to Richie. I've known him for a very, very long time. And I also just want to record my thanks that he's doing this for the virtual Féile. I think it's an indication of the spirit of the Féile, that even the pandemic couldn't beat it, that we're doing a whole range of these events. So Richie is the co-chair of the Friends of Ireland Congressional Caucus, and he's also currently the chair of the powerful Congressional Ways and Means Committee, and as I said previously, a long-time supporter of the Irish cause. So Richie, you're also a teacher, and maybe you could just, I think I may have said there you were elected first in 1988 or thereabouts. Maybe just tell us how you came from being a teacher, and I understand you still teach, but how you came from being a teacher into that very powerful position that you're now in.
Well, you know, I like to tell people that I saw John Kennedy the day before the election in 1960. He was in Springfield. He made his last 2 appearances in Springfield and traveled to Boston that evening to the Boston Garden for a pretty warm welcome, a pretty enthusiastic welcome. And I was in the crowd that day. I was 12 years old. My mother and my grandmother conspired to keep my sisters and I home from school so that we might see the next president of the United States. And about 24 hours later, he was the president-elect. And I call that a very important marker in my life, because I thought that that inspiration of seeing him as a barrier breaker was very, very important. So I went to work for Bill Sullivan. I was involved in a lot of campaigns. Bill Sullivan was the mayor of Springfield. I was that ripe old age of 23. And I worked for Bill, who was still alive, for 5 years. I ran for the Springfield City Council, and I served there for 6 years. Then I ran for mayor, and I served as mayor for 5 years, and then got elected to Congress in '88. So it's been 42 years of straight elective service. Very proud of it. I think that gives a nice institutional knowledge of the craftsmanship and the skill set that goes along with legislating and how important it is. I mean, there are those that are very good at shaping the narrative, as we know, because using demonstrations and using public events, but it's oftentimes legislation that changes lives. I lived and grew up in a pretty nationalistic household. My mother's family, the Garveys, they were from Vintry in County Kerry on the Dingle Peninsula. And my dad's mom was born in Banbridge in County Down, and they're still there. The McGiverns are the surname now. My last cousin, who I visited with some years ago, she lived on Ballygowan Park Road, as a matter of fact. And they, I think, were part of this long notion that, as highlighted in The Economist magazine this week, which I thought was a terrific piece about how successful the people on the island of Ireland have been in lobbying in America, which is a very important part, by the way, of our foreign policy, because our foreign policy is always in some measure a reflection of domestic policy. And the article highlighted just how successful the effort has been for this very small country with about 6 million people, north and south. But I also felt very strongly as a young man, because I actually knew men who had participated in the Easter Rising. The Kerry Brigade lived in Springfield. And so many of them, including the Fitzgeralds, had participated, and their children are still around. They've been hard, fast friends of mine for as long as I can remember. So I thought the cause of nationalism was a very natural, formative stage for me, and I embraced it with enthusiasm, and really believed that it made a huge difference. And remember that the Friends of Ireland was born to present a different dimension, because our position here in America was that we couldn't interfere in the north of Ireland because it was an issue that was domestic for the United Kingdom. Well, we rejected that argument, and we wanted a more balanced and even-handed approach. And I will tell you this, all these years later, it's worked.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But not least because of your efforts and the efforts of other men and women there on the Hill, and obviously people in your districts. And I suppose if you want the secret of the success of the Irish and getting the Irish cause onto the political agenda, it is that you retain your family connections in Bantry, in Kerry, and retain your family connections in Banbridge, County Down. And that's at the core of it's personal, it's home, it's, you know, obviously you're an American, but you're an American who's very, very proud of your Irish roots. But tell me a wee bit just about Springfield, because I remember going to the John Boyle O'Reilly Centre, and what always struck me was the last survivors from the Blaskets were there, but the first words said to me were in Irish. They greeted me. Do you remember that night?
I can remember it well. You actually got off the plane, I think, in Logan, and you drove to Springfield.
Mm-hmm.
And you were met by a pretty large crowd that night, if you remember.
Yeah.
Pretty enthusiastic and boisterous crowd. I've always thought that the further west that one goes, the more nationalism you encounter. And the Kerry men were pretty nationalistic, as you know. Mm-hmm. But the other part of their identity is they pride themselves on being native Irish speakers. And if you lived on the Blasket Islands, that was your first language. And as a young man visiting funeral homes and other gatherings, you would note quickly that Irish was the first language for many of them. And the Carneys and the Cathaoirleachs are two families that come to mind.
Yeah.
There's maybe one or two that are left that actually lived on the Blaskets, but their pride and their heritage, I think, permeated all of Springfield. It was, the Economist piece makes the argument that heritage is really important to Irish Americans. And I will always note, as one who still faithfully reads obituaries, that what's always striking about it is in the obituaries, the number of people that say he or she was very proud of their Irish heritage.
Mm. Yeah, well, funny enough, I read obituaries as well. I think they're very interesting to read about people and their sense of themselves, or their sense of the obituary writer's sense of themselves. But tell me now, you still teach a bit? I remember one time you said to me you keep teaching.
I've been at the University of Massachusetts for a long time, more than 20 years, and I have the title of lecturer at the University of Massachusetts, and it keeps me fresh. It is Sunday night preparation for a Monday morning lecture. I have never once tried to just pass it off. I think it's really important to those students to hear from a congressman and an individual who gives them a perspective that they might not receive in the classroom. And again, it takes me to the argument that we can talk about many issues, but legislating is what changed lives.
And tell me, in terms of your own sort of getting a handle on your own job as a Congress member, and I know you brought us through the challenges of being a local representative and cutting your teeth in that type of forum as mayor and so on. But does your work as a teacher inform your work as a lawmaker? Just that connectiveness with students and with folks?
I think it does, because I do encourage people to listen as well as to talk. And I think that demeanor and temperament are still a very important part of American political conversation. At a time when the internet, instant opinion, a media that is much more conflict driven because they've shrunk in size, they have a more difficult time in terms of offering context. So I think that a thoughtful presentation, at least hearing the arguments of the other side, even if you don't agree with them, but I think that it offers us a different dimension. So I don't say to these students that I want you to be Republicans or I want you to be Democrats in the classroom. I more or less say to them, look, this is what happens and why it happens, and this is what both sides really think. I think that was a pretty conventional view of American politics until about 3.5 years ago. And as we've allowed more and more entertainment to seep into American politics, which, by the way, didn't just start 3 years ago or 4 years ago. I think that entertainment and conflict drive more and more of the political discussion in America. And I frankly don't want to be part of that.
Yeah. Well, I'm very taken by what you say, because I think part of the problem with senior politicians is that you end up in a bubble. So that connectedness with students, with folks, with listening to them, encouraging them to talk, helps you obviously in terms of keeping your connections. But tell me this, just in terms of Ireland again. I think I recalled you telling me that your first public involvement with the Irish cause was the hunger strikes of 1981. Is that, do I recall that properly?
You couldn't be more accurate. It was powerful here in America. And the American media reported daily on the hunger strikers. And I recall lead stories on national news night after night of the caskets being taken from the homes of the hunger strikers only to be turned around by British soldiers. And I can't tell you what that did with Irish America. And the outrage that we all felt that Margaret Thatcher and her intransigence was allowing these strikers to die. And the power of that metaphor of the hunger strike, because of our own history with famine, it is something that has been carefully imbued in me. And it was for me a very telling moment as those caskets were brought to the front door, and they wouldn't let the tricolor rest on the casket. I couldn't believe it, that that was happening. So outrage in America, I think, propelled us to the moment that we now fiercely guard, and that's the success of the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, we'll come back to the Good Friday Agreement in a second. Richie, I just note, and we talk about struggle, that our friend John Lewis died, and John, who I met quite a number of times there, and clearly, you know, was one of the freedom riders, was one of the people who put his life on the line time and time and time again. The current situation in the States, the issue of race, because I've always felt that race is one of the unresolved issues in the USA, and you know that Sinn Féin never gets involved in domestic politics there. But I just thought that the passing of John Lewis at this time is one of the very few survivors of that era of the leadership. And what's your take just on, you know, on John's contribution? The civil rights struggle here obviously was influenced by what was happening in Martin Luther King's campaign. What's your take on John's passing, and what's your take on US politics at the moment?
Well, I went to John's funeral in Atlanta yesterday. I put together a special order on the House floor the night before. And incidentally, I used those special orders, if you recall, very effectively on Ireland.
Yeah.
And we thoroughly annoyed the British government by calling attention to those events. But John Lewis was a good friend of mine. We sat next to each other for more than 25 years on the Ways and Means Committee. And I embraced the pilgrimage that he annually would offer, taking us to the great civil rights sites in the U.S. The crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge was a rite for many of us. And on my wall, there's this magnificent picture of him just before the confrontation. And it was called Bloody Sunday. He was severely beaten. And we visited the Rosa Parks site. We visited the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church where Martin Luther King started. And Ebenezer yesterday, where John's funeral took place, that was Martin Luther King's prime pulpit. And what was stirring about the Lewis legacy, he lived out the argument about nonviolence. He was beaten within a whisker of dying. And a nice story for us that I'll share with you because I think it's powerful. The only hospital after Bloody Sunday that would treat the demonstrators who were near death in some cases in Selma, Alabama, was a small Catholic hospital staffed by the Sisters of St. Joseph and the Edmondites, where my middle name comes from. And the Sisters of St. Joseph treated them that day and for subsequent days, when everybody else in the other hospitals turned them away. So in 2015, because the Sisters of St. Joseph staffed the Elms College that you and Martin McGuinness visited, Sister Kathleen Keating, the Sisters of St. Joseph said, could you arrange to have John Lewis be the commencement speaker? And if you could remind him of the role that we played in helping him to heal. He accepted the invitation. He came to Springfield on a Saturday morning, and in front of 5,000 people in the Springfield Civic Center, when the tears rolled down his cheeks, and he embraced the president of the congregation, Sister Maxine Schneider, and they talked about what had happened on that day. So I think that we meet extraordinary people along the way in politics, really outstanding people, and we meet people that are quite not up to the challenge, as we know. But in the case of John Lewis, as testimony from 3 presidents yesterday, and I had a chance to talk to Bill Clinton afterward. And you know, I will be forever grateful for what Bill Clinton did in Ireland. He always brings that up immediately when he sees me. And we met him in New York, if you recall, and I think he felt he would never see us again. And we gave him a pretty tough time after that about Ireland. And I think one of my best memories was from Tony Lake after we stormed through a meeting with him one day, when Lake said, I promise you this, within the White House, I will raise Ireland to the same level as the Middle East, foreign policy. And another very important moment.
Let me tell you a little yarn just to the side. I know you'll understand this given your great interest in Ireland. Tony was telling me once, you know, about how this process should work, and he gave me a rundown on the rules of baseball. Right? So I came back home and I got a video, and I got it converted to the American system of an All-Ireland hurling final, and I sent it back to him and said, these are the rules of the game that we play in Ireland. And, you know, Bill Clinton's singular contribution, not least because folks like you and others in Irish America across the entire community put it on his agenda. But if you just reverse back a wee bit, you were one of the first people to come in support of the Hume Adams initiative. Okay. John Hume was a good friend of yours. John unfortunately isn't well at the moment, but you were one of the first to come in and say this is a way forward. This is about, if it's good enough for John Hume, if it's good enough for Gerry Adams, we should be supporting that. Do you want to talk a wee bit about just that, Richie, please?
I sure do. I thought that the strategy that you and John developed made it much easier for us in the United States just to say we supported the nationalist position as opposed to a position of Sinn Féin or SDLP. We support the nationalist cause. And I thought that the strategy that you embraced, if you remember, when I came to visit you, just after the ceasefire was announced, within a day or so of it, it was John that rang you up for me from his home. I was at his home and he said, I know you're going to want to see Jerry Adams. And he went to the phone and you were on the other end and the arrangement was made. And I think that, again, in terms of strategy, it was very carefully choreographed and it was very similar to what happened with John Lewis and the civil rights movement in America. There was very little in the civil rights movement in America that was left to chance. And I thought that that visa, and John Hume could be very humorous about those things, as you know, behind the scenes. And when the Brits were saying that the only way that there could be a visa was if there was a surrender of arms. And John, I'll never forget in a moment when he was laughing, he said, that is so foolish. He said, don't get those arms back in no time. He said, the way he said it, you know, it was and he pushed hard for that visa. And I did the defense of Bill Clinton that night on a British talk show called Newsnight. And I defended the visa. Everybody in Massachusetts signed the letter of support for the visa. And I want to say this about you, Jerry Adams, you kept your word every step of the way. And I also will tell you this from that Newsnight presentation from a pretty hostile reviewer, and Billy Tranghese will confirm it. It was the most difficult mail I ever received in my congressional career. There were not a lot of, from the UK, there were not a lot of letters saying, good work, Congressman Neal.
Very good. Billy Tranghese is Richie Neal's, I suppose, do everything person, great friend of Ireland, an outstanding human being. And the Trangheses, we understand, also come from West Clare. It's an old Irish name, Tranghese. So give my kindest regards to Billy as well, please. Now, if we just pause for a moment, so you guys get the visa. You know, Jean Kennedy Smith, God rest her, Teddy, John Hume, Albert Reynolds, Father Alex Reid, who you met subsequently, all of those people, but yourselves out there in the States played pivotal roles. And then we went through all of that faltering with John Major, and the thing fell down again. Tony Blair comes in, Bertie Ahern comes in, and we move into a slightly different plateau, and then that leads to the Good Friday Agreement. And I see a continuum going back to the points that you made about the Irish-American connection, about the strength of sentiment in the States, about the commitment of people like yourself and your colleagues, because what the US did, and you'll know Bill Flynn, the late Bill Flynn, and
a wonderful human being.
Feeney is still with us, and Neil O'Dowd played a good role, and Bruce Morrison, and so on. But what Irish America brought into it, and what the US administration and what the president brought into it, was you totally sundered that notion that this is an internal matter for the government in London, that it became an international matter. And that was, I think, one of the great breakthroughs in this whole process. And it's very interesting that for all the brouhaha from the British at the time of the visa, it wasn't too long before we had international commissions on arms, before we had an international commission on policing, before we had an international commission on justice and on other issues. So maybe you would just like to share your thoughts. I mean, where were you when you heard that it was Easter, when you heard that the agreement was made, and how did you feel? And did you have a real sense, as you should have, that you had played a part in this?
I did. And if you recall, one of the things that I thought was terribly important was, it was again the American position on strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement, which was Dublin-Belfast. And erasing that border was our priority. So I took the phone call from Sean O'Hegan about the referendum questions, which I thought was very clever, the way that it was done. And I took that call on a Saturday with a large group in the Hungry Hill section of Springfield, which was very Irish. And we were elated at the fact that a majority in the North and in the Republic had voted for the Good Friday Agreement. And I also think that, if I could for a moment, just to go back to Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton stood up to his own State Department and took the risk.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how important that was. And I will also say that one of the highlights of my career was, and Alex Maskey was there at the British Embassy when Tony Blair asked to see us from the Friends of Ireland. We'd had a very good meeting with him in London, and we thanked him for what he had done in the Good Friday Agreement. I've often heard you say, when the other side does the right thing, we need to say so. And we took that advice to heart. And I will tell you this is a good moment of satisfaction. It's absolutely true. Blair said that Adams and McGuinness, he said, they're two pretty smart guys. And for us, in that room with him that day, after he had done what other British prime ministers, including Churchill and Lloyd George and Gladstone and others had talked about, and Blair did. And I had a series of tough dust-ups with British prime ministers, including John Major, in a stormy meeting one day in the Speaker's office. But what was rewarding to me when that measure passed was the request that Blair had to meet the Friends of Ireland. And he said at the British Embassy, his farewell statement, and it's recorded somewhere, he said, America and the UK have been great friends and great allies over centuries. But he said there was one issue that the UK and America did not agree upon, Ireland. And he said there was a time when I would have seen the Friends of Ireland as a hostile force. And then he went on to say, you helped get us through this. And I thought, if he'd ever been at some of those dinners at the British Embassy with some of us, you would not have thought that the Prime Minister of the UK, Great Britain, would be offering praise to the Friends of Ireland. Stormy meetings over dinner at the British Embassy. I mean, I recall one British ambassador, he said, we've been through the niceties. It was a huge table. We've been through the pleasantries. I know there are strong opinions in this room. Let's have a go at it. Mm. And there was a period of time there, month after month, we were invited to that embassy to make our opinions known.
Yeah, well, fair play to you. I mean, it's quite amazing how, how change happens. It happens as part of a struggle. You don't get change, in my opinion, without struggle, whatever that happens to constitute. And then what was seemed to be just totally impossible happens. And, if you think back on it, I mean, you visited me one time in our office on the Falls Road, and it was a shambles of a place. And the place was bombed.
Well, it was. I left there that night, and I went back to the hotel, the Europa, and it was a very nice night. And I was having a pint, and I had a reporter from the Springfield Republican, Joanne Moriarty.
I remember her, yeah.
And she was very good on the national question.
Yeah.
But that night, after she heard the explosion, she insisted that we go back to the Falls Road. So the journalist jumped into one of those cabs, and of course, there was great interest in the fact that an American congressman had been there just hours before, and now the building was taken down. It was a car bomb.
Yeah.
And the car bomb took down the whole side of the building.
Yeah. Now, when you think back to those days, and then you think of now, when you think of the achievement of the Good Friday Agreement, which was a global achievement, at least certainly in terms of the Irish, the British, and the North American involvement. I know that you and the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and I thought this was very, very, very powerful, that you spoke out very clearly on the back of Brexit, that if there was any undermining of the Good Friday Agreement, that there would be no trade agreement. And then powerfully, you came to Ireland, along with the Speaker. You made the same remarks in Dublin, you made the same remarks up on the border at Derry, and you also made the same remarks in London. Do you still have concerns about Brexit, about the outworking of this, about the Good Friday Agreement, and what position will you and those who helped to create that agreement take in the time ahead?
Well, the Ways and Means Committee oversees tax, trade, tariff, Social Security, Medicare, pensions, and welfare. And it would not move through this committee if there's any threat to the border or the reestablishment of a border. And the Speaker and myself, we talked to Theresa May just the morning before we left. She said she was not available, which was understandable. But the two of us made it very clear there could be no bilateral trade agreement between the UK and the US if there was any jeopardy to the Good Friday Agreement. We met with the Brexiteers in London. I will say it didn't go that well. It was a pretty candid conversation, but again, when they stood up after lunch, there was no confusion about where we stood on it. And we expressed that from Dublin, and also made it very clear that there could be no agreement on trade if there was any threat to the Good Friday Agreement. I want to say this about Speaker Pelosi too. Not only was she great on the national question, but she was fully engaged. So there was a little bit of a wobbly response here from our State Department when we were planning to go to the border. And I called the Speaker and I said, we're getting a little bit of pushback here. And she said, we're going to the border. I thought, just great. I mean, the diplomatic corps, as you know, they have a role and they are worried about anything that is outside that lane. But I will just say this to you in terms of psychological gratification. Standing at that border with the Speaker is one of the highlights of my career. And for her just to reinforce the position was as powerful a metaphor as you could, I think, witness. And she's not a shrinking violet. She feels very strongly about this personally and professionally. And in Dublin that night, there wasn't anybody in that state reception with the Taoiseach and members of the government who would have been confused after she sat down from her remarks.
Yeah.
And I've expressed this to Bob Lighthizer. The British ambassador has called me a number of times. There have been 2 meetings. There's a 3rd scheduled. I think that the British government now says they don't see that there's any prospect that they could offer up a proposal before next year. But I have made it clear to Ambassador Lighthizer, who's named, by the way, as Robert Emmett Lighthizer, that he knows where I'm heading on this. And he is fully accepting of my position. And he has said to me, I have told them, forget it if you jeopardize the agreement. So is it desirable for the US and the UK to have a trade agreement? Sure is. But having said that, it is not going to be, after all of these years and the efforts that we've made, any prospect of going back to the bad old days with any effort to reestablish that border. I consider that elimination, again, to be one of the great highlights of American foreign policy.
So when the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, continues to be gung-ho on Brexit and on the difficulties that would deal out for Ireland, whatever the persuasion of people, the possibility of the border being reinforced and of all of those regulations coming back, you're saying very, very clearly that if he does that, then there will be no trade agreement.
And he knows that. And I will say this, that the ambassador, she's been very clear that they will not do anything that threatens the Good Friday Agreement or any effort that would reestablish that border. And I made it clear to her that we do not intend to go forward until we're convinced that the issue, the sanctity of eliminating that border is embraced.
And I also know, Richie, and you always give your positions in a very forthright but courteous way, that you've always been very, very open to unionism and listening and talking to unionism and trying to, you know, make sure that they also have a voice, at least the platform to state their position. You know, clearly the fact that when the Brexit referendum was held, the majority of people in the North voted not to leave the European Union, to stay within the European Union. And then the European Union itself said, look, if the North goes back into the European Union at some point, then or goes into United Ireland at some point, then they will automatically, the entire island will rejoin the European Union again. So in terms of our and I'm here in Belfast, the Assembly is back up and running. Today, the North-South Ministerial Council meeting is assembled. It's all the ministers there will be from the two parts of the island of Ireland, all dealing with problems and looking for solutions on the island of Ireland, the pandemic and other critical points. So would you like to give us your sense of what you think that the unionist leadership or the grassroots of unionism and you know, the grassroots of unionism, particularly in the towns, are the same type of folk in terms of their social and economic background as the people who would vote for you. So would you like to say anything to unionism about the future, and can the US play a role in the time ahead to try and act as guarantors for everybody on the island?
I had a series of very unpleasant exchanges decades ago with Dr. Paisley, and they were really hostile and drew a lot of attention, incidentally. But I also can say with great satisfaction that before the deaths of Dr. Paisley and Martin McGuinness, I welcomed them to the Capitol, where they had lunch with me, the Friends of Ireland, and the Speaker of the House came in, Nancy Pelosi at that time, to say hello as well. And I call attention to that because I think that convincing them that there is no threat to their identity in a united Ireland. We embrace in America a principle of unity without uniformity. And I very carefully follow the comments that are offered, very carefully follow the arguments that have been offered. And there's been a seismic change. And I think that, again, convincing them that whether it's for health or tourism or national security, that living in a united Ireland, again, represents no threat to their culture. And, you know, in America, they have a dimension that they've offered that was very important. And much of it in the North and South Carolina and Tennessee. I pointed out that the long history of the unionists at that time, the contributions they made, they would not have been called unionists at that time, but they were a major part of Washington's army. And I think that reassuring them, as we try to do, and I always thought one of the things that bothered me was that you would frequently get this argument when they returned to Ireland. They would say that they received a hostile reception in America. That was not true. We disagreed. That is not hostility. And that's an important consideration, because many of them would go back and say the Irish lobby is too powerful. I would say that's not true. We just disagree with the proposals for embracing the status quo. And in time, I think that our argument has not only prevailed, but under the magnifying glass of critical analysis, it's been sustained.
Yeah, very good. Well, tell me this. The Good Friday Agreement has set out, and it was a very key part of Republicans agreeing to it. It set out a referendum, north and south, as a means of deciding the future. Now, the president of Sinn Féin, Marie McDonald, has said, she doesn't want a referendum tomorrow morning. She wants a process of engagement, of planning, of dialogue, of information, and we want the government to facilitate that and to have as much involvement in it. And then at the end of that process, that people will be informed and so on. Brexit was a disaster, not least because there wasn't that type of process, and Ireland didn't even feature in the consideration of the government of the day in London. So we don't want to repeat the Brexit debacle. Now, there are demographic changes in the north. There are social changes. Unionism lost its electoral majority in the north. There are a huge amount of people who have lived post Good Friday Agreement peace, that they haven't known the conflict. Young people haven't known. There have been incidents, of course, and that's deplorable. But the vast majority of people have grown up in this new era. So, what would your best advice be? If we were able to get an Irish government to start the process of planning for the future, does the USA have a role in assisting that and helping to bring about a permanent end to the border, so that the people of Ireland can live together in our own place, whatever way we think is appropriate, on the basis of equality?
Well, I think continuing to nurture the process that we've engaged is really important. I have never heard in these years since the success of the Good Friday Agreement, anybody in the unionist community or the nationalist community make the argument for going back to the bad old days. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think when we reach our potential expands. That's a pretty essential argument. So I think the conversation needs to continue. I mean, again, Baroness Paisley has said some encouraging things. I would note that Peter Robinson has said some encouraging things. And I think that unionism has taken a different look at this. Given the success of the Irish economy, I think that that's an important consideration. But I also thought that the day-to-day engagement of Belfast and Dublin was terribly important. So I think for those of us who have great pride in our Irish heritage, simultaneously recognizing the unionist contributions and suggesting we represent no threat to their culture. And we think that engagement and convincing them in a full electoral process about the eventuality of a united Ireland is something that we all have a vested interest in.
Well, I remember during the negotiations for the Good Friday Agreement, President Clinton essentially promising that the USA would be a guarantor for the future. And I think he kept to that, and I think that you have also kept to that, you and your close associates and friends there. So I want to thank you for that. I mean, as I've said a few times, I'm here on the Falls Road, and it's just so magnificent to meet kids who will never have to visit a grave, never have to visit a prison, who can, as you say, reach their full potential. And as they do, their potential will expand, and all of that is in the future. So I want to thank you and your colleagues for all of that. If you had a word of advice to those of us who have been part of this process, and I know that you have said, continue the process, continue the engagement, and so on. What would your best advice be in terms of what you think the future role as we continue to move forward along the road, as I see it anyway, of seeking on the one hand to get the Irish government to engage properly and to plan. Everybody has to plan for the future, and then to get the British government to face up to its responsibilities, but particularly to persuade the unionists that their future does lie with the rest of us. What would your best advice be there, Richie, please?
Well, I think that it's within the crucible of politics that we find the way forward. And the patience that has come with it, recalling that I like to remind people that Ireland represented the longest standing political dispute in the history of the Western world. Mm-hmm. Astounding. But to recognize that for all of us, we still believe that there is a peaceful path to unification that represents, again, no threat to unionist culture, a full embrace of it, as well as what I noted earlier, there's nothing to be afraid of with unity without uniformity.
Yeah, and it's very interesting just when you say that about a peaceful path. We're the first generation to have that. You know, the 1916 veterans that you talked about in Springfield, they didn't have it. Robert Emmett didn't have it. Wolfe Tone didn't have it. Bobby Sands didn't have it. But we have it. And it's incumbent upon us then to seize that and to actually make it work. Well, look, it's great that you shared so much time with us. You said earlier on that Tony Blair said that Martin and myself were two smart guys, or I just want to say it was Martin was a smart guy. I was his helper along the way. But thank you for your commitment, for your support, for your advice. And I've phoned you many times in difficult times, and you've always given me wise advice, and that's the teacher in you. So I wish you well. I know that there are big elections coming up there. I wish you well in terms of all of that, and give my kindest regards to everybody there that we know, and stay safe in this pandemic, and we'll see you in Ireland, or we'll see you in the USA in the time to come.
I look forward to that. You've been a good and loyal friend to me and to America and to Ireland. Thank you, Jerry.
Go on, Margaret, Richie. Go well, Cara, and thank you again.
All the best.
Long that.